Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling a topic that's changing the global landscape: how countries are increasingly intertwining trade with their values. You actually sent us a fascinating source this time, a white paper from the World Economic Forum. The WEF.
Yeah, the one with that big annual meeting in Davos.
Exactly, where all the global leaders get together to discuss, global challenges.
Yeah, the WEF isn't like a governing body or anything. It's more of a platform for, these crucial conversations. And this paper is part of that,
And this paper is called Trade and Values: Navigating the Intersection of Policy and Principles.
right? They're diving into how countries are now using trade to achieve goals that go beyond just simple economics.
It's not just about, getting the cheapest t-shirt anymore.
Yeah.
Imagine buying a t-shirt but knowing that it was made without exploiting workers, or choosing a coffee brand because they're actively fighting deforestation.
Yeah, it's really a major shift from that traditional view of trade, which was really all about economic efficiency.
Hmm.
The idea was to make production as smooth as possible, lower prices, provide consumers with more choices.
Yeah, makes sense.
But now we're seeing countries using trade as more of a lever to advance what are called non-trade objectives, or NTOs.
NTOs, can
Yeah,
you break that down for our listener?
sure. Think of it this way. NTOs are goals that go beyond just purely economic gain. They often reflect a country's social and political values. So a good example, the U.S. banning goods from China's Xinjiang province
Oh, yeah,
over concerns about forced labor,
exactly.
or the EU's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the
Yeah.
CSDDD,
Yeah.
that requires companies to conduct extensive audits to make sure their supply chains are free from, human rights abuses and environmental damage.
And it even affects companies outside of the EU if they want to do business there.
Right. It's really a big deal.
Uh,
So we're seeing how these values-driven policies are starting to have a real impact on global trade. Definitely. And then there's the EU's deforestation regulations, which have caused some tension with palm oil producers, like Malaysia and Indonesia.
Yeah, it's a really complex web of policies and regulations and values. So the big question is, why is this happening now? Why are values suddenly front and center on the global stage?
Well, there's no one answer, but the WE's paper does point to a few key factors.
Mhm.
One is a genuine belief in these values. A lot of people, especially in developed countries, aren't satisfied with just getting cheaper goods anymore.
Yeah.
They want to know that those goods were produced ethically and sustainably.
Like, we're seeing a shift in consumer consciousness.
Right.
People are realizing their choices actually have power, and they're demanding more from the companies that they support.
Absolutely. And
Mhm.
this consumer pressure is leading businesses to actually change their practices, sometimes going above and beyond what's legally required.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about IKEA's commitment to using 100% renewable energy in their factories.
Oh,
That wasn't just a random act of generosity. That was in response to consumer demand.
right.
And it was also a way to attract customers who care about the environment.
And that move actually had a ripple effect. When a big player like IKEA raises their standards, it puts pressure on competitors to keep up.
Totally. Sustainability becomes less of a nice to have and more of a must have.
The competitive necessity.
Yeah.
Yeah. But alongside, the genuine concern for values, there's also this kind of strategic element at play.
Oh, for sure. Countries are using values as leverage in trade negotiations.
Oh, interesting.
Like if one country wants access to another country's market, they might be pressured to adopt certain labor or environmental standards.
So it's almost like a new form of diplomacy where economic power is being used to push for social and political change.
In a way. Yeah.
But it makes you wonder, is it always about genuine concern, or is it sometimes about, gaining an advantage?
It's often a mix of both.
Right.
And then you can't forget about domestic politics.
Oh, of course, politicians need to keep their voters happy.
Exactly. Politicians are under pressure to show that they're listening to concerns about globalization,
Jobs, the environment, social justice, all that.
all of that. So using trade to promote values,
Hmm.
it's a way for them to say, look, we're not just blindly supporting free trade, we're making sure it benefits everyone.
Right, and holding other countries accountable to their standards.
Exactly. And that message is powerful, especially now with the rise of populism and skepticism about global institutions.
So it's a savvy move for politicians. But the WEF paper also highlights some of the challenges involved in trying to align values across different cultures and political
Oh,
systems.
yeah. What's considered a fundamental right in one country might not even be recognized in another.
So how do we create a truly global system of values-driven trade when there's no universal agreement on what those values should be?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. The paper uses the example of forced labor. Most countries would agree that slavery is wrong.
Right.
But defining exactly what constitutes forced labor, that's where things get tricky.
It's like that situation in Xinjiang that we mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
The U.S. sees certain practices as forced labor, while China views them as vocational training programs. Two completely different interpretations of the same reality.
Exactly. And it's creating this major rift in trade relations.
So this difficulty of aligning values globally is a big theme in the WEF paper.
Yeah.
They even argue that trying to impose values through trade can backfire and lead to resentment.
And accusations of hypocrisy.
Yeah, and this brings us to another point of tension: the pushback from developing countries.
Yeah.
They argue that these values-driven policies are actually hindering their development.
Right. It's like they're saying we need trade to improve our standards,
Yeah.
not restrictions that keep us from participating in the global economy.
Yeah, they feel like they're being held to a different standard.
Yeah, and the WEF paper acknowledges this. They point out that developed countries need to be mindful of their own history.
And avoid imposing unrealistic expectations on others.
Exactly. The paper uses the EU's deforestation regulations as an example.
Oh.
The EU sees it as this groundbreaking climate policy.
Yeah.
But countries like Malaysia and Indonesia feel like they're being unfairly targeted.
Right.
They argue that the EU already benefited from deforestation during its own development.
And now they're dictating terms to countries that are still reliant on palm oil and things like that.
Exactly. It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Yeah. So it seems like businesses are really caught in the middle of all of this.
Oh, absolutely. They're facing this threefold challenge.
Okay, let's hear it.
They have to comply with this growing web of regulations.
Mm.
They have to meet ever-evolving consumer demands, and they have to stay profitable in this increasingly competitive global market.
Right.
It's a lot to juggle.
Yeah, and to make matters even worse, social media has become this powerful force, holding companies accountable for their actions in ways that we've never really seen before.
Oh, for sure. One viral tweet or a social media campaign can make or break a brand.
Right.
It makes companies incredibly sensitive to public perception and the values that they project.
High stakes. So in this new landscape, businesses are having to adapt constantly. But here's where it gets interesting. The WEF paper also highlights how businesses are often leading the charge on values.
Yeah, that's a little surprising, right?
Yeah, bit of a twist.
You often think of corporations as these profit-driven machines.
Right.
But the reality is much more nuanced. Many businesses are realizing that incorporating values into their operations isn't just good for the world. It's also good for their bottom line.
It's not just a PR stunt. It's actually good business.
Exactly. Take DHL, for example. They've committed to using clean transport for 70% of their deliveries by 2025.
Wow. That's a big goal.
That's a bold move. And it's not driven solely by altruism.
Mm.
They understand consumers are choosing companies that prioritize environmental sustainability.
So they're getting ahead of the curve.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just DHL. Companies like Unilever are pushing for living wages for their suppliers.
And Walmart has their Project Gigaton.
Right. To reduce emissions across their supply chain.
These are great examples of businesses aligning their operations with their values. It's not just about responding to consumer pressure either.
No.
It's about attracting and retaining top talent.
Exactly. Especially younger generations want to work for companies that share their values.
So being values-driven is both a moral imperative and a smart business strategy.
Absolutely.
Right.
But it's not always straightforward. Businesses are also facing these complex dilemmas when values clash.
Oh, can you give us an example?
Remember that situation with Western apparel companies facing boycotts from both Western and Chinese consumers over the Xinjiang issue?
Oh, yeah. That was a tough one.
There was no easy answer.
Yeah.
They were going to alienate someone no matter what they did.
Right.
It really highlights this complexity of this new values-driven landscape.
Mm.
And it brings us to another major shift that the WEF paper addresses, the rise of China and its impact on the global system.
This is where things get really interesting. For a long time, the U.S. and EU have been the dominant forces pushing values through trade. But with China's economic power growing, their approach is gaining traction. And it's very different.
Yeah, it's almost like we're seeing these two contrasting models emerge.
So describe these two models for me.
Well, the U.S. and EU are actively linking trade with values, often using economic leverage to promote human rights, labor standards, and environmental protection. But China takes more of a hands-off approach.
Interesting.
They emphasize national sovereignty and non-interference in other countries' affairs.
So these two approaches are creating this whole new dimension of competition in the global trade system.
Exactly. And developing countries are watching closely, trying to decide which model works best for them.
It's a tough choice to make. The stakes are high. So is it better to align with the US and the EU and their values-driven agenda, or with China's non-interference approach?
That's the big question. And this tension between these two approaches is only going to grow in the coming years.
So are we headed towards a world where everyone agrees on a set of shared values? Or are we going to see the world splinter into different blocks that are aligned with different value systems?
That's the question, with profound implications for the future of global trade and the international order as a whole.
Right, the US and the EU using trade to promote their values, while China's rising influence offers this completely different model. And it's all really fascinating, but it's also a little daunting. So where do we even begin to make sense of this new world order?
Well, the WEF paper actually offers some guidance,
Hmm.
and they start with a really good point: a healthy dose of humility. It's basically saying, hey, not all values are actually universal.
Yeah.
You can't just go around assuming everyone will see things your way.
Right. We often just take our own values for granted.
Yeah,
We forget that other cultures and societies might have different priorities or interpretations of things like individual rights or the role of government or even what's considered ethical behavior.
absolutely. Take freedom of religion, for example. It's a
Oh.
cornerstone of a lot of Western democracies.
Right. Freedom of religion.
But in some countries, religion is so intertwined with the state, with the culture, that the very idea of separating them might seem completely foreign or even dangerous.
So, step one is acknowledging that we're not dealing with a one-size-fits-all situation. There's no universal value system we can just impose on the rest of the world.
Right.
Okay, so what's the next piece of advice from the WEF?
Well, they really emphasize time and support.
Okay.
They're saying if developed countries want to see their values adopted globally, they need to be willing to provide both the time and the resources to help other countries get there.
You're saying you can't just expect a developing country to instantly implement these complex labor or environmental standards.
Exactly. Especially when they're struggling with things like basic infrastructure or poverty reduction.
Right, they have other priorities.
Exactly. So the paper suggests that developed countries should provide things like financial assistance, technical expertise, training programs, even equipment.
To help those developing nations raise their standards.
Yeah, it's about partnership,
Mm.
not just preaching.
The paper actually mentions the Paris Climate Agreement as a pretty good example of this approach,
Wow.
where countries have different responsibilities based on their capabilities. It's not about punishing those who haven't developed as quickly, but recognizing we're all in this together.
Right. Sustainable development's a journey,
Mm.
and it requires collaboration and support from those who have already benefited from those earlier stages of industrialization.
Okay, so we've got humility, we've got time and support. What's next on the WEF's list?
This one's pretty straightforward. Avoid hypocrisy.
Oh, don't be a hypocrite.
What? Yeah. Basically, don't hold others to standards that you can't even meet yourself.
It's so easy to point fingers at other countries and say, oh, your human rights record's terrible, or your environmental regulations aren't strict enough. But are we always practicing what we preach? You know?
That's the key question.
Yeah.
And the paper uses the USMCA trade agreement as an example.
Oh, the updated NAFTA.
Yeah, between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada.
Right, where the U.S. pushed really hard for stronger labor protections in Mexico,
Exactly.
arguing it would level the playing field.
Right. And prevent companies from moving jobs south just to exploit cheaper labor.
Right. But some critics pointed out that those same labor standards weren't being met in certain U.S. states.
Exactly. The ones with right-to-work laws.
So it's a bit hypocritical.
It's a reminder that we all have room for improvement.
Yeah.
And we need to be honest about our own shortcomings before we start lecturing other countries.
Lead by example.
Exactly. And that also means not giving certain countries a pass on values just because they're geopolitically important or they have resources we need. Consistency is key.
Okay, so we've got avoid hypocrisy. We're on a roll with these guidelines. What's next?
Okay, so this one gets into the nitty-gritty of policymaking. The WAF argues that when we're pushing this values-based agenda, we need to think carefully about the trade-offs, especially the economic impact on developing countries.
What kind of trade-offs are we talking about?
Well, like if you restrict trade with a country because of its human rights record, you might actually end up hurting the very people that you're trying to help.
Right.
Like sanctions can sometimes punish ordinary citizens.
Make it even harder for them to get basic goods and services.
Exactly. Unintended consequences.
Oh, yeah.
We might have the best intentions, but if we don't think things through, our actions can backfire.
Make the situation even worse.
Totally. The paper reminds us that trade restrictions can have a real impact on people's livelihoods, their access to healthcare education, their ability to just put food on the table.
So before we jump on the bandwagon of a specific policy, we need to ask ourselves, are the benefits worth the potential costs, especially for those who are already vulnerable?
Exactly. It's not about virtue signaling or making ourselves feel good. It's about making smart decisions that actually improve people's lives. And sometimes that means taking a more nuanced approach, recognizing that progress takes time.
And there are going to be trade-offs.
Right.
This whole values-driven trade thing, it's a lot more complex than it seems at first.
It really is. And the WEF paper doesn't shy away from that complexity. They offer another guideline that kind of speaks to this. Be mindful of colonial legacies.
Ah, yes, history matters.
It does. A lot of the countries now pushing values through trade were once colonial powers.
Right.
And while that history might not be the driving force behind their policies,
Mm.
it can create sensitivities and even resentment in those former colonies.
It's like they're saying, hey, we were there. We did that. We don't want to be lectured by the same countries that exploited us.
Exactly. The paper really stresses the importance of approaching these issues with humility and awareness, recognizing there's a lot of baggage.
Baggage from the past.
Yeah. Associated with the history of colonialism and how it shaped the global power dynamics that we see today.
So context is everything. We need to be sensitive to the historical experiences of others.
Absolutely. It's not about dwelling on the past. It's about acknowledging it and learning from it so we can build a more equitable and respectful future.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. Humility, time, and support. Avoid hypocrisy. Think about the trade-offs. Remember history.
And make those regulations practical.
Oh, right. Practical regulations? What was that one again?
It's about making sure the rules you're putting in place are actually enforceable, especially for small businesses in developing countries.
Right. It's easy to come up with these big ideas and sweeping regulations.
Yeah.
But if they're too complicated or burdensome, they can become barriers to trade instead of drivers of progress.
Exactly. The paper uses the example of a small furniture manufacturer in Indonesia. Could they realistically comply with the EU's regulations on deforestation or carbon emissions?
Probably not.
If not, those regulations might actually prevent them from accessing European markets, even if they're trying to improve their practices.
So it's about finding that balance, setting high standards, but also making sure those standards are actually achievable.
Especially for businesses in developing countries that might have limited resources or capacity.
Right. The goal is to create a system that's fair and effective, and that benefits everybody involved.
Exactly.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. Humility, time, and support. Avoid hypocrisy. Assess trade-offs. Be mindful of history. Make regulations practical. These are all really great takeaways from the WEF paper. But it seems like we've only scratched the surface of this whole values-driven trade thing.
We have. It's complex. There's no easy answers. But at least we have a framework for thinking about these issues.
That's a great starting point. And I'm so curious, what's the WEF's overall conclusion? Where do they see all of this going? Are they optimistic? Are they pessimistic?
Well, they acknowledge that this integration of values into trade, it's a major shift. It's not going away. It's driven by this complex mix of idealism and strategic interests and even geopolitical tensions.
This is kind of messy.
It can be. But the paper also emphasizes that it's not all doom and gloom. There are both challenges and opportunities.
Okay. So tell me more about these opportunities. What are they?
Well, one thing, this whole trend is forcing us to have some difficult conversations.
About our values.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And how they shape our actions on the global stage. It's pushing us to be more transparent, more accountable, more mindful of the impact of our choices.
It's like we're finally realizing that we're all interconnected.
Right.
Our actions have ripple effects.
And that awareness, while it can be uncomfortable sometimes, it's essential for creating a more just and sustainable world.
So it's not about going back to some pre-globalization era.
Yep.
It's about shaping globalization in a way that reflects our values.
Exactly. And benefits everyone, not just a select few.
And the WEF is optimistic about the potential for positive change.
They are.
They believe we can create a global trade system that's both prosperous and ethical.
If we can find ways to work together to bridge those divides, to focus on shared goals.
I like that vision.
Yeah.
But how do we actually get there? What are the steps we can take to build this more equitable and sustainable future?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
It starts with awareness.
Hmm.
We need to pay attention to the values that are baked into our buying decisions. Think about where a product was made. What were the conditions? Like, what's the environmental impact? These are the questions we should be asking.
So before I grab that, cup of coffee or that new gadget, I need to pause for a second.
Yeah.
Not just thinking about, oh, this looks cool or how much does this cost, but thinking about the story behind it. Like, was someone exploited in the making of this product? Did it contribute to deforestation or pollution?
Exactly. And it's
Mhm.
not just about where things are made. It's also about the companies that we choose to support. Do their values align with ours?
Mhm.
Are they transparent about their supply chains and their labor practices?
It sounds like we need to do our homework. Like, read labels, check company websites. Maybe look for those independent certifications like fair trade or organic labels. It's a lot.
It can feel overwhelming.
But even small changes can make a difference.
Absolutely. You don't have to be perfect overnight. Just start making more conscious choices, step by step. Support the companies that are genuinely trying to do the right thing, even if it costs a little more.
It's about putting our money where our mouth is.
Right.
Like, if we really care about ethical sourcing and sustainable practices, our spending should reflect that. But it can't all be on the consumer. What about businesses? How do they fit into all of this?
They're crucial. Businesses are absolutely essential to creating this values-driven trade system, and they're facing pressure from consumers, from investors, even their own employees.
Right, everyone's demanding more transparency, more accountability.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned earlier how some companies are going above and beyond the regulations.
Yeah, trying to do the right thing.
It's great. But how do we tell the difference between genuine effort and greenwashing? How can we be sure companies are walking the walk and not just talking the talk?
Yeah. How can we tell?
Look for those concrete actions, measurable goals,
Hmm.
not just vague promises. Are they investing in renewable energy? Are they improving working conditions in their factories?
Hmm.
Are they supporting fair trade practices?
And it's not just about checking boxes, it's about changing the whole system. Are they advocating for policy changes that support ethical and sustainable practices across the whole industry?
Right. Are they working with governments and NGOs to address the root causes of things like poverty and environmental degradation?
Those are all good signs, right?
Yeah, those are the signs of a company that's really committed to these values. And remember, they're not going to get it right every single time.
Yeah.
But are they open to dialogue? Are they willing to admit when they make mistakes and actually make changes?
It's about progress, not perfection.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. And as consumers, we can reward those companies that are trying
Yeah.
by choosing their products and services.
Yeah, our purchasing power can make a difference. But it's not just about what we buy. It's also about using our voices.
That's right.
What do you mean by that?
Well, we can contact our elected officials. Yeah. Let them know we care about these issues.
Let them know we expect them to prioritize values and trade agreements. We can support organizations that are working on fair trade, human rights, environmental protection.
And don't underestimate the power of conversation.
Yeah.
Talking to our friends and family out these issues, raising awareness, sharing information, encouraging them to be more conscious consumers.
Creating a ripple effect.
Exactly.
Starting with our own choices and then, bringing others along.
Right, spreading the word.
So it's multi-pronged, right?
Yeah.
We make informed choices as consumers. We hold businesses accountable. We're engaged. We're talking about these issues. It's a lot. But it also feels empowering. Like we're not just passive bystanders in this global system.
Exactly. You have a role to play. You can actually help shape this.
So that's the main takeaway I hope our listeners are hearing today, right? This new era of values-driven trade, it's got both challenges and incredible opportunities, and it's up to all of us as individuals, as businesses, as governments, to decide what kind of world we want to build.
It's about recognizing that trade isn't just about economics, It's about our shared humanity, our values, and the kind of future we want to leave for the next generation.
So it's really about realizing that every purchase we make, every conversation we have, every action we take can contribute to a world that's more just, more equitable, more sustainable.
That's a great way to put it.
That's a powerful thought to end on. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today.
That's great.
It was. We hope you'll continue exploring these issues and use your voice to help shape a future where trade is a force for good in the world. So until next time.
I'll see you later.